Qiana Johnson is Interim Associate University Librarian for Collection Strategies at Northwestern University. Qiana is going to be talking about how to navigate some of these questions around privacy and assessment that she's been dealing with. So Qiana, you want to draw up your slides? And you're set to go.
The slides okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much for everyone for being here and for NISO for inviting me. I think throughout my talk, you're going to hear echoes of some of the conversation that we've been having over this afternoon. And I wanted to note that I'm coming from the information privacy conversation from perhaps a very traditional librarian lens. And this lens works to protect patrons' ability to access and consume information with little to no outside observation. And by outside observation, I'm including observation by libraries, vendors, and government entities. Second, my slides are not advancing. There we go. In an era of exclusively print or physical items, maintaining patron privacy was perhaps a little bit easier. But as more and more content has moved online, there are more and more parties involved in the provision of information resources. And maintaining this core library value has become more difficult, but it hasn't gone away. According to the American Library Association, 48 states and the District of Columbia have laws protecting the confidentiality of library records. And the language varies from state to state about what they consider a library record and circulation records, but patron privacy is legislated in almost all locations. Libraries and the organizations they work with need to familiarize themselves with the current requirements of the state, as well as any pending legislation. And while there are numerous legal requirements and professional standards underlying those privacy requirements, there's also the ethical value of people being able to consume any content they have appropriate access to through the library without being observed. Personal and professional growth is sometimes a messy and often deeply personal enterprise. What information is accessed can be influenced if a user knows or even believes they're being watched and possibly judged based on the information they're choosing to access. Part of my role in my library is collection assessment. I look at how well our print and electronic materials are being used and try to gauge how well we are supporting our users. I try to walk a fine line between data-driven decisions and protecting patron privacy. And when in doubt, I try to err on the side of patron privacy. When I'm trying to assess our collections, I'm trying to determine how much and how often materials are used, as well as if materials we have purchased or licensed are meeting the needs of our users. And trying to answer these questions while also respecting patron privacy can sometimes feel like walking a tightrope. Analyzing what materials are used and how often is often an easier assessment to do while maintaining patrons' privacy. This is especially the case for the circulation of physical materials. Many ILSs will allow you to generate a list of materials that have or have not circulated, and that information can be examined by date circulated, by attribute of the material, such as publication date or subject, and the type of circulations within the library or outside of the library. User information is stripped from the circulation record once materials have been returned, so usage patterns can be examined without matching that use to individual patrons. Depending on the configuration of the ILS, some information could be gathered about use of materials depending on patron group types. Some ILSs will allow you to explore circulation patterns by patron type, such as undergraduates, graduate students, and faculty members. These populations are frequently large enough to be able to look at trends across a group without being able to identify discrete users. Where maintaining better privacy while also getting better data comes into play is if circulation data can be pulled based on school or department. And depending on the size of that school or department, the possibility of identifying individual users becomes greater. Let's say we want to look at the circulation patterns of undergraduate students, of which there are 3,000, and then decide to make that more specific by looking at the circulation patterns of undergraduate German language majors, of which the university only has 10. Because of the small size of the German language major undergraduate population, maintaining these students' privacy is not as assured as if the library is studying all undergraduates. There are also similar opportunities to study how users are taking advantage of other systems available to acquire materials, such as interlibrary loan. Looking at patterns in the materials being requested through ILL can give libraries a picture of real-time patron collection needs. Are there particular subjects that patrons are consistently requesting, or particular material types? Examining these use patterns can allow the library to identify areas where we may want to assess or expand the library's existing collections. As with the circulation of the library's physical holdings, libraries will want to look at how granular the patron identifying information is that is attached to those ILL requests. The more specific the information is, the easier it is to identify individual patrons. But being able to assess how the library is serving a particular patron population is a good thing, right? But at what cost does the library obtain this information? Libraries have advertised themselves as spaces where users can explore topics privately. That desire to locate and use collection materials privately can be born of a concern relating to why they're seeking out that information. Medical issues, locating information about accessing resources around sensitive personal issues or other topics. If someone is trying to investigate information about how to be a whistleblower, that's information that's deeply private and they want to keep that protected. There's also the question of how user behavior and the resources they choose to access might change if they know or believe they are being observed. Will users choose to use a resource because it's the one they want to use and is available? Or will they choose to use another resource for fear of being judged based on their preferences? If you've ever been part of a user study of looking at library websites and how to improve them, and you ask a student to start their research however they would, how often do we get them to say, well, normally I would start with Google, but because I'm here in the library, I'm going to start in the library. That act of observation has changed their normal behavior. Maintenance of patron privacy has perhaps been easier to maintain around physical materials because assessment and use of those materials has been quantified in systems that the libraries have almost exclusive control over. When we look at maintaining patron privacy around the evaluation of the use of electronic resources, the number of parties increases and the values and priorities of the varying parties involved in providing this information can make maintaining that privacy more challenging. One method libraries have to monitor the use of electronic resources is counter-compliance statistics. These statistics allow libraries to monitor usage of electronic journals, books, databases, and other online materials, and largely not match the use of those materials to individual users. With this information, libraries are able to explore how frequently materials are used, compare the cost per use of different materials, as well as get a ballpark figure of cost per patron of different resources that support different disciplines. Do we on average spend X dollars on patrons in economics versus Y dollars on patrons in sociology? The partnership of libraries and vendors through the provision and use of counter statistics allow assessment of resources while allowing libraries to maintain their values around privacy. In order to protect access to electronic resources to members of a library community, there are varying types of authentication methods across the library landscape. And some of these authentication methods are chosen and maintained by the library, while others are put into place by the library's parent organization. And it's at this point that differing priorities can have impacts on patron privacy. Libraries have to work with their central administration to understand what information, particularly personally identifiable information, is being collected by these systems, advocate for collecting the least amount of PII possible, and understand what the data retention schedule is. Because of the differing priorities, building and maintaining relationships within central administration are important to be able to gently push back on larger policies that don't align with library values. And I will stop here and readily admit upfront that the library might not always be able to push back on the campuses and central administration's policies that aren't as privacy protecting as we might like. But with steady communication, incremental changes are possible, and allies sympathetic to library values can be identified. I think sometimes our automatic tendency is to collect as much data as possible in case we need it down the road. The problem with that is that the more data we gather, the more data that has to be secured and protected. Another problem with just generating as much data as gathering as much data as you can is that later when you might possibly go to use it, it might not have been gathered in a way that you need for analysis. A better place to start is to determine what question or questions you're trying to answer, followed by what is the smallest amount of personally identifiable information that needs to be gathered in order to answer that question. Additionally, questions to ask are who will have access to the raw versus summary data? How long will the data be kept? And are you really sure you need to keep it indefinitely? And finally, how are you articulating to users what information you are collecting about them and that you're allowing others to collect about them? It's also important for someone within the library to have read the privacy policies of the vendors from whom we license or subscribe content. And I note that it's important to read each of them because they will all be different. It's important for libraries to know what information is being gathered about their patrons, who that information is being shared with, as well as how and if users can opt out of data being gathered about them, and closely examine that ability to opt out. How easy is it to find out how to do it? And then how easy is it actually to do? And can patrons get their data deleted? The ease or lack thereof of opting out is a serious barrier to patrons having control of their information. Also, if libraries have negotiated privacy protections for their patrons, it's important for the libraries to alert their patrons to that fact, especially if those protections are stronger than the blanket policy that is often found on the vendor's website. Libraries should look at how and if they're educating their patrons about the information being collected about them and how they can control that. This is particularly important because patrons may see their relationship as being with the library, who they're accessing the resource through, and not an unknown to them third party. Libraries have a lot of trust placed in them by their communities, and that trust can be broken if a patron's data is breached. And let's talk about data breaches. How is that information communicated to patrons? Is it even communicated to them? Libraries have a responsibility to their patrons to know what information is being collected about patrons, how the amount of data collected can be limited, communicate that to the patrons, and communicate to patrons if that data has been breached. A surefire way of breaking trust is not to be as honest as quickly as possible. So what does all this theory look like in practice? As an example, if the library wants to gauge the success of an instruction program or marketing within its community around the use of electronic resources, one tool the library can take advantage of is its counter statistics. By comparing the usage statistics of a specific group of resources before an intervention and then a month or so after an intervention, libraries can begin to see how effective their actions are. And in this example, an intervention can be a particular group of instruction sessions or a marketing campaign in the student union. Because examining the possible change in usage numbers will not be able to be matched to students in a class or to a patron who saw an ad, this assessment method can be a more privacy-protecting means of gauging success. Once patrons are within a resource, there are also ways that libraries can gauge if a resource is useful to patrons. Particularly in the counter statistics for journals, libraries can get the number of searches done as compared to the number of articles accessed. Does a resource show a large number of searches? And if so, does there seem to be a corresponding number of articles accessed? Perhaps a high number of searches that appear to turn into clicks shows that users are locating materials that at first glance look useful to their research. However, here too, there are caveats to this method. Counter statistics are not providing a means of tracking a user from their search to the number of articles that they choose to access. This method isn't gauging the success of individual searches, but rather the success of collective searches. And this method will just tell us if users accessed articles, not if those articles were useful for their research inquiry. The design and presentation of a search interface will also impact user behavior. If users can get the information they need from the results page, a lack of subsequent hits is not necessarily a sign that the resource is not meeting user needs. Looking at circulation statistics of physical materials owned by the library can tell you how well used the collection is by subject, publication date, or other topics. But does a high circulation rate show that the library is meeting the information needs of its users? Users may be checking out a large number of materials, but were those the materials the users wanted? Did they just choose to use a title held by the library because the one they really wanted was either already checked out or the library did not have it at all? Or did the user feel that the available materials were of high enough quality for their research? And how do libraries begin to answer these questions? Let me walk you through two options that I have thought about and the challenges I identified with both. The first option was a short-term survey. When a patron returned a book, they would receive a survey asking questions about their satisfaction with the returned item relating to their teaching, learning, or research. As I was thinking about this assessment, I considered how to try and get information about the usefulness of individual titles without having a record of what an individual person has checked out. How could I create an opt-in option for this study, either at the beginning of the survey period or when the patron receives the survey? And if a system can be developed somehow to separate the linkage between what an individual checked out and their feedback on the usefulness of that item, will patrons even believe that the linkage doesn't exist or won't be maintained after the length of the study? As I alluded to earlier, will there be concern about their reading habits being observed and they choose to alter those reading habits? While the study could have great value to assessing the usefulness of the collection to the library community, in order to maintain patron privacy, complicated systems will need to be put into place in order to maintain that privacy. And those systems may not ever be strong enough for patrons to feel comfortable. An alternative method of assessing the usefulness of the collection would be to look at publicly available actions by patrons. In order to gauge that a resource was useful to patrons, I could look at resources that they cited in their published scholarship. The library could examine what resources were cited or available from the library in its own physical materials or materials the library had licensed or subscribed to. The benefit of this method is that the works are publicly available and do not require asking users about their reading habits. This method is not without its drawbacks. Just because a user cited materials that were available through the library, that does not mean they accessed them through the library. As well as this method does not capture materials a user may have consulted and used as a reference and not cited, and materials that they reviewed but were outside of their research interest, or because the quality of the materials did not meet the user's need. And while this method could be employed for faculty research, it would be harder to employ for graduate students and undergraduates. The library could partner with faculty members to collect the bibliographies from student papers. And this is a method that has been done, but again, it's the informed consent of our students. Are we letting them know that this information will be collected in a way that they did not consent to? Materials that are produced through the product of classroom learning, will they feel that they're being judged as opposed to the library being assessed? And as we can see from these examples, there is a frequent tension around assessing the collection while maintaining privacy. In order to maintain privacy, libraries may have to accept that the answer to some questions are unknowable. Libraries will also have to identify and become comfortable with various proxies to show usefulness. Assessing the value and usefulness of library collections can often feel like walking a tightrope of maintaining and protecting patrons' privacy and examining and assessing the use of library materials. Walking this tightrope becomes challenging as libraries are partnering with vendors for the provision of resources and with campus and administrative partners around what information is being provided to the library, as well as what information is being gathered from the library. There will never be a one-stop solution for everything, but will require continuing conversations with relevant partners to advocate for library values while also being able to answer questions from our stakeholders. And here are the credits for the images that I used for my presentation. And then thank you. And my contact information is here for anyone who'd like to reach out.
Thank you, Qiana. I think we may just have lost Todd briefly.
Sorry,
What?
I was talking. I was just on mute. Problem with having multiple mutes. Qiana, thank you for your presentation.